When Richard II relinquished his kingship, he compelled Henry IV to pledge his life would be preserved. Yet, pledges are susceptible to being broken. Henry ensured Richard's demise was unspeakably cruel. King Richard II stands as one of the most infamous rulers to have occupied the English throne. While William Shakespeare may have immortalized his malevolent tenure, the genuine account of his life is considerably more somber and intricate. From inception, Richard was an impostor. Born in the year 1367 to Edward, the Black Prince, and Joan, Countess of Kent, Richard was not even born within England, the very realm he was destined to govern. The future sovereign was, in fact, born in southwestern France, within the coastal city of Bordeaux, which officially designated him as Richard of Bordeaux. From the very instant of his arrival into the world, he initiated a period of great upheaval. Despite possessing significant cognitive impairments, Richard was physically gifted. He stood 6 feet tall and possessed a comely appearance. And although he ultimately lost his grip on reality, he was an intelligent and well-read individual. He did, however, exhibit one notable failing. When agitated, he would stutter. His birth and subsequent inheritance were unusual in multiple respects. Firstly, the future king was not the offspring of a reigning monarch. His father, Edward, held the esteemed position of Prince of Wales and was next in the line of succession to the throne. However, Richard was also his youngest son. The fact that he ever ascended to the throne was nothing short of miraculous, occurring only through profound tragedy. When he was a mere boy of 4 years of age, his elder brother, Edward, succumbed to the bubonic plague, having lived only 6 years. Regrettably, this would not be the final instance in which the devastating illness profoundly impacted Richard's existence. The passing of Richard's brother inflicted a severe blow upon his father. He had contracted dysentery, and the overwhelming grief exacerbated his ailment, rendering it fatal. Richard's father died before ever assuming the crown. Richard was merely 10 years old when he was crowned King of England. His coronation ceremony was a grand 2-day event, marked by immense pageantry. London truly celebrated, allowing wine to flow freely. Indeed, wine cascaded from fountains throughout the city in a display of jubilant festivity. While the wine flowed and the parades proceeded during Richard's coronation, the populace was also presented with their very own castle. This colossal temporary structure was erected in the heart of London, and from its 4 turrets, 4 maidens showered the young Richard with gold as he passed by for the ceremony. At the tender age of 14, he confronted his inaugural significant challenge as king. In 1381, the notorious Peasants' Revolt erupted in response to the king's imposition of increased national taxes. Groups of men converged, besieged, and incinerated key locations across the capital. It was utter pandemonium. However, Richard sought refuge within the Tower of London. Eventually, he recognized that to maintain his hold on the throne, he needed to assert his authority. On the 13th of June, he embarked on the River Thames to confront the rebels and engage in negotiations. Richard facilitated the dispersal of the Peasants' Revolt by extending clemency to the rebels, only to swiftly revoke the decree. He then took matters a step further and personally led his forces onto the battlefield to decisively quell any lingering dissenters. As a sovereign possessing vast resources, his efforts were terrifyingly effective, yielding dire consequences for the remainder of his reign. The Peasants' Revolt initiated Richard II into the harsh realities of power through bloodshed, and he never forgot the grim lessons learned during those few formative days. As he matured, he began to guard his crown with ever-increasing possessiveness, ultimately becoming a fervent advocate for his absolute authority. At the zenith of his reign, Richard had transformed into a caricature of a villain. Firmly believing himself to be divinely chosen, the king became notorious for his profound ineptitude in interacting with commoners. He was exceedingly susceptible to flattery and spent the majority of his reign sequestered within his court amongst his various favored companions. Although he was ruinously vain, certain historians posit that even darker influences were at play during Richard's ill-fated reign. Some scholars have ventured so far as to suggest he suffered from schizophrenia, while more recent research indicates he may have had a narcissistic personality disorder. Richard II's dedication to the arts and culture did yield some positive outcomes. English was developing as a literary language during this period, and Richard's sophisticated court significantly contributed to its advancement. In fact, the progenitor of English literature, Geoffrey Chaucer, was employed in the king's court early in his career, and his writings paved the way for subsequent literary giants such as William Shakespeare. Richard did not merely appreciate portraits of himself. He also had a penchant for ostentatious jewelry and elaborate textiles, expending substantial sums on adornments for himself and his loved ones. While much of this finery has been lost to history, one of the most exquisite examples of Gothic jewelry, Queen Anne's crown, endures to this day. Richard was a monarch in development, necessitating a queen. His attention settled upon Anne of Bohemia, whose lineage was as distinguished, if not more so, than his own. Her father was Charles IV, also known as the Holy Roman Emperor. Their union might have appeared to be a strategic political alliance from an external perspective, but the reality was quite different. Everyone disapproved of the prospect of Richard and Anne becoming a couple, with the exception of Richard and Anne themselves. Anne brought no dowry to England, yet the king desired her regardless. In fact, he was obliged to compensate her family for the privilege of marrying her. They were both 15 years of age, and they were wed at Westminster Abbey on the 20th of January, 1382. In 1387, Richard II's reign truly began to unravel when a faction within Parliament, known as the Lords Appellant, succeeded in ousting all his favored courtiers from positions of power. However, Richard had been engaged in a power struggle akin to the Game of Thrones since the age of 10, and he eventually regained control. He then enacted a brutal reprisal. After re-establishing his authority, Richard located and executed nearly every one of his adversaries. Yet, he was not finished. In a move characteristic of a definitive villain, he then ventured into the countryside and executed any commoners who had supported the rebellious lords. Thus commenced a new era, Richard's tyranny. Despite never having any children, Richard and Anne shared a period of 12 blissful years together, and numerous historians believe she was as beneficial to his reign as she was to his emotional well-being. She fostered greater compassion in him and tempered his violent inclinations in matters of state, and he repaid her with unwavering devotion until the day their world collapsed. In 1394, an old antagonist of Richard II reappeared. In that year, his beloved wife, Anne, contracted the bubonic plague, the very same disease that had claimed Richard's brother and weakened his father. Shortly after contracting the illness, Anne passed away at her residence in Sheen Manor. Richard was so profoundly grief-stricken that he had Sheen Manor demolished, ensuring he would never have to gaze upon it again. For the remainder of his reign, he behaved irrationally and grew increasingly cruel. He did not hesitate to channel his personal frustrations into his political dealings. While campaigning in Scotland, he received the devastating news that his mother had passed away. Richard's reaction was beyond comprehension. Perhaps channeling his emotions, he unleashed his soldiers upon Edinburgh, and collectively, they almost obliterated the city. Having experienced the ravages of love, he resolved to arrange a strictly political marriage with the French princess Isabella of Valois. This might sound relatively normal until one learns that Isabella was merely 6 years old at the time of their betrothal. Richard was 29. Surprisingly, marrying a virtual child was met with disapproval, even within medieval England. However, when his advisors raised this concern, Richard appeared unconcerned. He flippantly responded that with each passing day, the issue would resolve itself. Richard made a catastrophic error by seeking retribution against the Lord's appellant. He spared a select few individuals, including his cousin Henry Bolingbroke. If that name resonates, it is likely because he is the very man who would soon violently depose Richard and assume the mantle of King Henry IV. However, it is the manner in which Henry achieved this that has become infamous. Richard II had been the preeminent figure for decades, but even he recognized Henry Bolingbroke as a threat. Henry's royal lineage protected him from execution during the Purge. But Richard went even further. To appease him, Richard elevated Henry to the status of Duke. Richard committed another calamitous misjudgment around this period. He had claimed indifference to Isabella's young age, but he should have been concerned. Richard was still without an heir at the time of his second wedding, and Isabella was far from being of childbearing age. This lack of a successor rendered him even more vulnerable to the impending coup. Ultimately, Richard might have retained his crown and his life had it not been for his impulsive decisions. Henry Bolingbroke was unwilling to make any move for the throne until Richard delivered a blow to him. Initially, he had Henry exiled. Then, upon Henry's inheritance, Richard seized all his properties and extended his exile in an effort to consolidate control. Whereas Richard II's predecessors were formidable warrior kings, he adopted a considerably different strategy. Rather than spending his time engaged in combat alongside his troops, he amassed his own private army to carry out his commands without him having to exert himself personally. This contributed to shaping our modern perception of a remote king ensconced within a lavish court, but it also ultimately led to his downfall. Eventually, Henry Bolingbroke forced his way back into England to reclaim his inheritance. He could not have selected a more opportune moment. Richard was absent in Ireland, accompanied by the majority of his loyal nobles. Consequently, Henry sailed unimpeded, gathering support as he progressed. By this juncture, Richard had become exceedingly unpopular, and a reckoning was imminent. Although individuals consistently urged him to stage a coup, Henry initially avowed that his sole desire was his financial assets, not the crown. It was Richard who altered the course of events. With his aversion to conflict, Richard surrendered to his cousin almost immediately upon his return, desperately offering Henry the crown in exchange for his life. After the transfer of authority, Henry placed Richard under confinement within the formidable walls of the Tower of London. Richard, regretting his recent conduct with considerable haste, erupted in a furious outburst, vociferously demanding the return of his royal diadem. Subsequently, on the 13th day of October in the year 1399, Henry formally seized the vacant royal authority from Richard II, thereby ascending to the throne as King Henry IV. Following this pivotal moment, he delivered the ultimate decisive action. Although Henry had initially pledged to grant clemency to Richard and allow him to live, he soon recognized the significant peril posed by the continued presence of a deposed monarch. He understood the necessity of resolving Richard's fate, but the method he employed was exceptionally barbarous. Rather than resorting to a conventional execution, such as beheading or a customary hanging, Henry subjected Richard to a far more agonizing demise. Gradually, day by painstaking day, he allowed Richard to waste away from starvation within his confinement until the former sovereign finally perished. Then, on the 17th day of February, Henry unveiled the grim results of his nefarious deeds, exhibiting Richard's lifeless, emaciated remains within St. Paul's Cathedral for public viewing. Whether driven by remorse or a pragmatic desire to quell any lingering sentiment, Henry interred Richard swiftly and without ceremony at King's Langley Priory. However, in due course, Richard received a measure of posthumous vindication. More than 10 years elapsed before Henry's successor offered an apology and arranged for Richard's reburial at Westminster Abbey, placing him beside his cherished Queen Anne. We appreciate you watching History Expose. If you find joy in discovering the most compelling narratives from the past, please express your appreciation by liking this content and subscribing to our channel to continue your explorations with us. Remember to visit our primary platform, Factinate, for an abundance of astonishing facts spanning a wide array of subjects.